Hello and welcome. I'm Robin Sears. I'm a research scientist with a degree from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies in 1996, now called the Yale School of Environment, with its first woman dean since 2016. It's such a privilege to moderate this panel called Planet Earth in Peril. So welcome, everybody. We are, as a global community, barreling towards the planetary boundaries upon which we depend into uncertain and uncomfortable territory. The climate crisis is playing out in social, political, and economic systems that are rife with inequities, where communities and individuals are marginalized and threatened by the very institutions and policies that are putting Gaia in peril. There's a lot to do, and on so many fronts, to stop the degradation of the Earth systems and to achieve environmental justice for all. We have a fantastic panel of Yale women who are out there taking action every day. Themes will emerge on this panel that distinguish and unite their approaches. And I hope this inspires all of the participants to take action on any dimension of the climate crisis that calls to you. Together, we can move mountains in the best sense. I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists and encourage you to read their bios on the screen and read their work. Frances Beinecke is the former president of the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, and brings her influence to many public and private commissions and advisory boards. Elizabeth Kolbert is a journalist and Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Sixth Extinction and a staff writer at the New Yorker. Rhiana Gunn-Wright is director of climate policy at the Roosevelt Institute and co-architect of the Green New Deal. Desiree Lopes is opening doors and lifting voices of marginalized individuals around the world, now as director of programs at the Future Skills Center in Canada. Welcome. I'd like to start with a question to all of you so we can learn a bit about you and about your approach. But Rhiana, perhaps since you are the behind the most ambitious endeavor, I'd like to start with you. Who are you working, each of you, who are you working to influence in their behaviors and decisions? Quite simple.
Yeah. Sure, and it's an honor to be here. I describe the folks, the audience for the Green New Deal as the folks who are the willing and also the willing to be moved. Often I feel like in climate, there's been a lot of discussion of folks who don't believe in climate change, right? And moving them and influencing them. And I think with the Green New Deal, we weren't actually trying to move anyone who didn't believe that climate change was real, that was a climate change denier. We didn't try to move anyone who didn't believe that equity was should be sought after in a green transition. And we didn't go after folks who didn't care about economic inequality, simply because that takes, not only does that take a ton of work, those folks are like, those pools of people are smaller often than the people who are willing to be moved. So really it was about talking to folks who didn't know a ton about the climate crisis, but were willing to do something about it, folks who might have known and hadn't been called to action, and folks who, for various reasons, are permeable to pressure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Desiree, would you like to tell us what you do, who you target, who you work with?
Absolutely. Can you all hear me well?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good start, isn't it? Hi, everyone. I'm so flattered to be here today sharing this virtual stage with all these amazing women. Thanks for having me. And as Robin started about a little bit of my background, I really working with those wanting to do things differently. to benefit people, to benefit the environment, and especially those that need the resources that we sometimes have access to the most. And whether this is in the private sector, academia, in the government, or with nonprofits, I love working to influence people who perhaps don't think things can be done differently, or even those who want to but need the resources and need the support to do that. And an internship actually back in Brazil in college that started this all that really inspired me to continue doing this work after already a few years. And I was doing as a forest engineering major, a lot of work in forests and measuring trees and finding that really exciting, right? To use equations and calculations to find carbon stock in forests. And the interesting part of all this, despite being also very technically interesting, was that a lot of these areas were where forests and poverty were really side by side. So without really knowing, I was already learning how to benefit the environment, we really need to put human beings at the center of the equation and really consider what their desires, their aspirations, their needs are before really we start with our own agenda in most places. And actually an initiative right here or right there at Yale is trying to do this in tropical countries. And I think it's a really interesting work for those who want to know a little more about tropical conservation in several countries in the tropics. And they're trying really to balance how we conserve, restore forests and ecosystems, but thinking about the people that are already there and leave from a lot of these places that we want to bring conservation and mitigation of climate change. So I'm really excited to be here with you today, and look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to move to Francis, who has at NRDC has hired so many people and has also so many people. And I mentioned because Desiree is working to provide skills and jobs to people who otherwise might not have opportunities. So Francis, who are you trying to influence? Who have you been and continue to influence?
Well, I have had a long career, many decades in the environmental community. And the environmental community, is a group of people passionate about the well-being of the planet. But what I've really focused on, I'd say, in the last decade is who is bearing the brunt of environmental harm, listening more to their voices, figuring out how to amplify and tell the story of environmental degradation, disproportionate impact, and have a very human face. I think what Desiree said is right, that this is about the well-being of the planet very much, but we as a human race depend on our natural systems. And we, I think, are going to be most motivated by the human story. And I spent a lot of time at NRDC going to places that were on the front lines, whether it was New Orleans for after Katrina, or West Virginia, where mountaintop removal was coming from, or in Canada, Fort McMurray, where the boreal forest was being ripped apart by tar sands development, and really talking to the people who lived in those communities who were most seriously affected, and getting a little bit out of where NRDC spends most of its time in the policy arena and trying to connect those policy stories to the human story that we're all experiencing more and more. And I think that what we've all seen in the last month here in the United States, between the fires in California and the storms raging across the Gulf of Mexico, is that we are all on the front lines of the climate crisis, and how to connect our voices with one another and become a political force. I've spent a career in the field of policy, but if we don't have the political muscle to move policy, and I want to tell Rhiana how appreciative I am of her work and the Green New Deal, and really beginning a climate conversation in the United States that the environmental community had been trying to have for decades and had not really succeeded in doing beyond our own world. And the Green New Deal actually transformed that conversation, as have the extreme weather events that are impacting literally millions of people across the country. So connecting voices, telling stories, amplifying impact, and creating political muscle. That's what I'm interested in.
And what you've been doing. Speaking of storytelling and writing about it, Elizabeth Kolbert, tell us what you do, how you approach. Who are you trying to reach with your writing?
Well, as you mentioned, I usually write for the New Yorker. So on some level, a really simple answer is just I'm trying to reach anyone who picks up the New Yorker, whether you're, in the dentist, whether you're a subscriber or pick it up in the dentist's office or pick it up, years later somewhere. So that's sort of the simple answer. I guess the more grandiose answer. And I also do want to say, I meant to preface this by also thanking all my fellow panelists and saying it is really a tremendous honor to be on the panel with so many women who are really making a difference. I am a journalist, and I really take a pretty old school view of journalism that the function of a journalist is to get the information out there. And I guess one thing I would say in slight, sort of contrast to what Frances is saying, I am really often trying to tell stories that are not human stories, that are stories about other species with whom we share this planet, and increasingly with whom we are coming into conflict in the way we treat this planet. And so one of the great challenges, I think, of this story of the fate of the planet, really, I suppose, which is the fate of not just humanity, but all the other species, is to tell the story in a way that other species get a voice. How's that? And it's I think that is I think that's super important. How's that?
Yeah, great. So policymakers, people, other species, those who are, I think the Green New Deal, Rhiana, it sounds like what you all have provided is a framework for those who already want to make change and can use your framework to do that work. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes, I think we're, also trying to reach people who might not have thought about making change in sort of the climate sphere or climate policy. But yeah, I think that's accurate overall.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I want to go to the roots. In a panel on Thursday, in the first session of the Yale at Women event, the panelists spoke about the requirement to address the root causes of social inequity if we're going to see real meaningful change. We've seen a rather extraordinary shift in the climate narrative from talking about global warming in the 80s, climate change in the 90s. Now we're talking about the climate crisis. And this shift seems to recognize the social dimensions of the phenomenon. So I would like to ask, and Desiree, perhaps starting with you, what are the root crises of the climate crisis, kind of in its broad sense, the root causes that you, in your work and in your life, see the need to address?
That's a tough one to address for sure, Robin, and I think that's why we are here discussing this today, and why we work so hard to keep these agendas going. And for me, my work, I think one of the opportunities that I've been experienced with working in the tropics, and I'm from Brazil, so I spend a lot of my time there. And we start shifting the conversation, how climate change was first a hurdle, right? Something that we needed to address for political reasons or reputational risk management. And we start seeing opportunities in how actually think about the climate crisis in a way to decrease social inequalities, let me put it that way, right? There are opportunities for us to do this at the same time, and actually one agenda lifting the other versus having to think about climate or people, right? Environment or people, and how we start seeing, as soon as I think as a global community, we start accepting that climate change is here. We start seeing a lot of events, as Francis mentioned, in the US, but also in many other parts in the world. And as soon as we saw that, right, a lot of damage, a lot of negative consequences, we start moving, right, and start thinking about ways to actually put these agendas together in many places. I am under no illusion that we have changed systematically the way we do things, really to put inequality and climate crisis in the same agenda and try to address both of them. But there are many examples of folks that are already doing work that we can draw from. And I want to mention again the Environmental Leadership and Training Initiative here at Yale, very much our own Yale School of Environment folks that are really thinking about how you can think about sustainable agriculture, how you restore ecosystems and forest landscapes that are directly related to the goals of climate change mitigation and adaptation, but thinking about that from the perspective of people that can actually change, those that are on the ground. And not only, I'm going to emphasize this point, I think, throughout the panel, because I think it's very close to my heart to see how we sometimes drive our own agenda in these conversations, but there's a lot of voices and a lot of people that can contribute that are interested in seeing how this all pan out, that sometimes are just not included in the dialogue.
Yes, and I would turn to Rhiana then, because what's remarkable about the Green New Deal is that it really addresses so many issues. And you need so many different kinds of people working on those issues. Is there and there are dozens of causes of the climate crisis. Are there any particular that really stand out for you as root causes of the climate crisis?
Yeah, definitely. So I think one is certainly racial capitalism. I think particularly in the US, one of the things that has allowed the fossil fuel industry to flourish and to continue sort of unabated for as long as they have been, is that most facilities are in low-income Black and Brown communities, right? And that was a decision for lots of reasons, business reasons, but also political reasons. Those folks don't have as much power, and also it really bifurcates our understanding of fossil fuels as a problem, right? You have sort of the most marginalized people in society experiencing the worst parts of fossil fuels, which is when you burn fossil fuels, you essentially poison people, right? And then the rest of us who don't live near that largely see fossil fuels, right, as neutral, except for the issue of climate change, which creates real issues when you're trying to move it as a political, right, issue. And it makes it a lot easier to use as a political football. And so I think part of what the Green New Deal was attempting to do was to address those issues of racial capitalism, and also address some of the other core issues, right, at the heart of climate change. Again, part of some people consider this part of racial capitalism, other people don't, but like the intense concentration of corporate power, right? We often think a lot about climate policy as sort of emissions reductions, things to do with clean energy, but economic policy is climate policy, right? Most of our emissions come from our economy, the ways that we structured it. And so any attempt to untangle that has to change the composition of economy, and that is going to affect a lot of people. And so all of a sudden, it's not just the climate crisis that you're up against, but if you're trying to move anything, it's the fear of the transition. It's the fear of what happens to my healthcare if these jobs go away, et cetera. And so the Green New Deal essentially tried to tackle a lot of these causes, again, particularly racial capitalism, corporate power, concentration of corporate power, because that's the way that people experience the climate crisis, right? They don't experience it just as parts per million. They experience it as economic effects. My house burnt up in a wildfire, or in a flood. They experience it as health effects, right? I'm getting sicker. My child's asthma is getting worse because because the air quality is so bad, right? Because of wildfires, et cetera. So this is how people are experiencing it. So it's essentially a way, and it's also the way that it is sort of all a ball of these different factors. So it was really an attempt to essentially try to address the climate crisis in the ways that we experience it as humans, and not sort of in the ways that we often try to deal with issues, which are very siloed, which might make it easier for us, but doesn't actually make that reality.
Yeah. Really bringing it to both acknowledging the crisis and addressing the crisis very much on the ground with people. Where Elizabeth, you said, you have focused more perhaps on the biodiversity side of things and the impacts and consequences there. What did the things that Rhiana just mentioned, resonate with you? Does it feel like, are you in this silo, or are you also crossing these boundaries into the social sphere?
Well, I think, just to put my 2 cents in, I guess, about what if we can identify a root cause of what's going on, I think the root cause is, and I do agree with Rhiana completely, it is about how we structure our economy. And I think that the problem is really, really profound. It's, a consumption and an economy, all global economy based on consumption of resources. And there are a lot of us, there's almost 8 billion humans on the world right now, on the planet, consuming very unequally, completely unequally. We in the US consuming way, way, way more than our fair share of resources. But, another problem, another unbelievably important and very difficult to address issue is equalizing or making more equitable global consumption, at the same time recognizing the limits to as Robin pointed out, sort of planetary boundaries that we are, many scientists would say, not just bouncing up against, but actually have gone over in several key areas. So, how you reorganize an economy, a global economy that has to, feed and clothe and house a lot of people, and a lot of people deserve to be fed and clothed and housed a lot better than they are right now, without and pulling back from these planetary boundaries at the same time. That is the challenge of our time. Those are interlocking and unbelievably difficult challenges in my view.
Yes. Frances, have you seen shifts in your time?
Well, so I think Elizabeth has stated the challenge. And I think the good news, I guess, is, and this is to Rhiana's point, that these issues are now getting interconnected. The issues of social equity, racial equity, economic opportunity, and environmental crisis, climate crisis, are now one and the same thing. And for years in the environmental sector, working on climate, we've been talking about the need for transformational change in the energy sector. We have to move from fossil fuels to a clean energy future. A lot of that is happening, but that has to be connected to these other issues as well. And I think it's beginning to be. So the conversation is very different in 2020 than it was in 2010 when we were trying to get legislation passed in the Congress. The opportunity, now we're not only talking about the crisis, but we're also talking about opportunities. When we talked about the opportunity for green jobs back in 2010, we didn't have a lot of data on that. Now there is a tremendous amount of evidence that there is a very powerful economic opportunity that's being created in the clean energy transformation that's a lot larger than what that's currently in the fossil fuel sector. And so how we connect where the opportunities are, but also drive the policies that bring those to the right scale and accelerate them so that we act within the very, very limited time frame that we have is the challenge. But I think that the opportunity that we have is bringing these voices together from all sectors and breaking out of the silos. And I guess if 2020 is noted for anything beyond all the disasters that are befalling us, it is that these silos are breaking down and that these issues are being interrelated one with another. And then as a result of that, much more powerful coalitions are developing around where we need to go, both politically and from a policy standpoint. So, I think if you're in the environmental field, you have to be an optimist because the challenges are so great. And, if you vacillate between hope and despair all the time, but hopefully hope trumps, not to forget that word, that you're more hopeful than you are despairing. And there's so much that makes us despair, but I do think that there is a movement afoot, thanks to the younger generation, to Rhiana, to Desiree, to Greta Thunberg, the strikers, the Sunrise Movement, et cetera, that are holding us accountable, holding my generation accountable to actually take the steps that are necessary to ensure the long-term well-being of humanity. I mean, this is an existential crisis. This is about the well-being of the planet and all the creatures on the planet, to Elizabeth's point. We know what situation we're in. The question is whether we have the courage and the power to change it, and we have to. So to your point, Robin, in the beginning, we all have a responsibility here, those of us who made a career out of it, but those of us who are just citizens on the planet. We all need to, through our own behavior and through actions that we could take in the political sphere or in the policy sphere or in the research sphere, to get on with it, because we have very, very little time to do this. And as a regular reader of Elizabeth's articles, if we don't get going now, we're in such serious shape, which we are. So everyone who's listening and watching this video, please be part of this movement. We need every voice.
Yes, the intersectionality of the climate crisis can be liberating in some ways, but it really blows it up into this very large thing. And I find sometimes for some people it might be hard to keep a focus on what they're doing. Desiree, maybe you can speak to this not only to the focus, but also talk about root causes, but also how do you keep going?
That's a great question. I think we all have very specific ways and have tried a lot of things out by now to keep going. As Frances said, it is part of what we all do. If we are doing that through our careers and our jobs, or if we are interested and do other things for our jobs, it's part of a conversation that we all should keep going with. For me, really, I think coming from working with a lot of marginalized groups and trying to find ways to find solutions to how you lift people up and at the same time conserve ecosystems and do really, really systemic changes, right? These are very complicated topics to address with those that don't have much in life, right? They have struggled by a lot and by many generations to even get where they are right now. So having the conversation, hey, you got here right now, let's take some of that away from you because we need to conserve the environment, right? I think that's some to Elizabeth's point at early on, right? How do you deal with that balance? And it's very hard. What I try to do in my day-to-day, and has worked well so far for me, is really try to find the people that are doing good work out there, those that, despite political changes and governments and whoever's in power, we always have good people trying to do good work and connecting. I think Yale has been a wonderful network to connect with people that are really trying to do something despite what they have. If it's little money in a small NGO somewhere, or if it's a lot of money, maybe the too much money problem somewhere in a bigger government, there are always people trying to do good work. And I try to do that also with my own teams, the way I choose where to work and spend my time, the way I hire my team, the way I work with other teams and other organizations. I think this is all part of, again, it's a big problem, but I think the little we can do in the day-to-day to keep ourselves motivated and remind all of us that we have little time is a bigger problem than actually what we can tackle. But there are always examples of people trying to do really exciting, motivating things out there. So that's how I keep going.
Several of you, well, thanks, Desiree, for sharing your secrets for keeping going. I think, Francis mentioned the youth movement and people resisting is key, and it's very strong in this moment. Policy has worked to some degree, policy shifts have worked to some degree. The institutions we've built, as Desiree has mentioned several times, Yale is the Yale Forestry School, School of the Environment. Now, a remarkable institution in terms of networking. Now, we're biased, we're from that school. Hopefully, we're all connected with institutions that are that keep us connected to each other. Several of you have mentioned sort of trade-offs. Of course, to make gains in one area, there may need to be losses in another area. And with business as usual, even incremental change, things are not shifting as quickly as possible. Weighing this reality that there will be trade-offs, and any of you could answer, what are the what do we have to give up to get the gains that we need to keep the temperature at a level that keeps us alive? And who is it that has to give up those gains? Who has to give up those? Who has to give up the most? Any of you would like to answer? What are the trade-offs? Who gains? Who loses? And who needs to lose the most?
Well, shall I jump into that? Because, clearly the largest emitters, starting with the United States, then China, then the EU, have created the climate catastrophe that we're in. So, we bear the responsibility to get moving and to, you can say, what are we going to go without? And I think that Elizabeth described that our lifestyle in the United States is well beyond what our own planetary boundaries are. But, the other side of that is that we are so inefficient in how we use resources. There is so much efficiency to be gained in our use of energy and our use of raw materials, particularly here in the United States, our recycling, our reuse, our the level of consumerism. If we're serious about addressing the climate crisis and living within planetary boundaries, so other countries, developing countries, have access to a level of economic well-being that is deserved, we have to really change our lifestyle and do the research and develop the innovative approaches that can get the efficiencies out of the very inefficient systems that we have. So, part of it is doing without, but, I've been admonished for like 40 years of my career. You never can say that you have to go without, because that's such an unpopular thing here in the United States. But I think that efficiency is number one across all sectors. And for that, I think that there's tremendous opportunity in research and innovation and looking at how we can do that. I mean, you look at how the natural world functions in a much more efficient way than we do. There's so much to learn if we weren't just as wasteful as we are in our day-to-day. But the other thing I just wanted to mention, too, is, where's the motivation coming from? Well, the environmental community is always sort of on the outside, pushing the corporate sector to get on board, be leaders, et cetera, et cetera. But to me, one of the good news areas is that it's the employees of these companies that are pushing them to be aggressive in creating climate targets. And, this gets to the point of where's the action going to come from? It's got to come from inside our own communities, our own corporations, organizations, et cetera. It's when, we as a community of human beings on the planet take responsibility for our own activities and encourage others to do so. So, we have to change fundamentally. We're in a transformational shift about how the human race lives on the planet, and hopefully we can actually make the changes so that we can all survive.
Can I jump in for 1 minute? I got an email shortly before we went on live today. There's a group of people who are actually committed to changing Yale. Yale Forward is the website, and trying to put candidates for the Yale Corporation who will put climate change front and center. And I think that there's no place to start that's better than starting with higher ed, people who are thinking about these problems and who really need to put their money where their mouths are, as it were, and no place better to start than our mother institution of Yale University.
Yes, thanks for sharing that, Elizabeth. Yale Forward has forward candidate Maggie Thomas. The election will come not for some months now, but we can start by voting at that scale, right?
But also you can sign the petition now. If you go on Yale Forward, you can sign the petition to get Maggie on the ballot.
Yeah, great.
YaleForward.org, I think it is.
Yep.
Yeah, could I jump in on this question about
Please.
What we'll have to lose? Yeah, so I think about these trade-offs a lot. And one thing that of course we'll lose, that we talk about all the time, or people ask us about a lot with the Green New Deal, is jobs, right? Like we will, if the Green New Deal, if an economic mobilization to decarbonize happens, those jobs will be replaced. There will be far more jobs, but there's still, I think, a real mourning and a real grief with the loss of occupation. Some of these things people have been doing for generations. And also there's just always a grief when a way of life that has existed doesn't exist anymore. And I think we have to always give people the space for that, right? And to acknowledge that any transition does involve loss, and it's okay. It's okay to feel particular ways about that. The other thing that I think, and I've been thinking about more often in my work, is something else that we have to give up, is essentially really using people of color as buffers in our system and as ways to solve our problems. And by that, I mean, right, like I've talked about the fossil fuel industry in the States, or even just thinking about the Dakota Access Pipeline, right? That was supposed to go through Bismarck. Bismarck is 98% white. They had like a series of town hall meetings, and it got rerouted through tribal land, violating treaties, right? There was another option, which is don't do this. But instead, we said, hey, we have the right to exploit these set of folks. And something that I run into actually a lot with the Green New Deal, when we first put it out, people, for very, for various reasons, some real, some really valid, some not. People are like, this is so big. And so why would you do all of this? Why do you have to do all of this? But the fact is, like, in fact, you do have to do all this to, one, transition an economy, and again, to do it without saying certain people, we get to put their lives on the line. We get to put their health on the line, right? We get to exploit the fact that they have less power in order to do these things, because for a very long time and in very real ways, that is how we have solved these problems. And even thinking about how we've interacted with the global South and their resources, consistently the ways that we solve difficult problems is to exploit those that are marginalized. And the fact is, something I think is very interesting about the climate crisis is we might have finally run up against the one thing where that's just not possible. It is far too big of a thing to solve in the timeline that we have, even sacrificing all of the people of color that we could possibly sacrifice. And I think until we actually face up with the ways that we solve problems, the ways that we use people of color as a public policy solution, we will be really stuck in our ability to see real solutions and move on them.
Thank you, Rhiana. How to make that shift? Yes, absolutely. The people who are causing the problems have to solve them. They have to take sacrifice. One of the sacrifices is we just can't be fracking. We can't be running pipelines through endangering communities and biodiversity and all this, ecosystems and people. How to make that shift? I mean, Elizabeth, is it that providing evidence, is it uplifting the people of color communities with information, evidence, skills, jobs? That maybe is one side of the equation, but the other side, of course, is getting the people in power to recognize the destruction that they're causing. Any of you can speak to how to do this?
Well, I think that, people have been breaking their head on this for, 30, ever since, Jim Hansen arranged for Tim Wertherin, for, Jim Hansen to speak before the Senate in 1988. Everyone's been thinking, how do we affect this transition? And I think that the honest answer, once again, from a journalist point of view, is we don't know. The Green New Deal is is one attempt to answer that precisely this question. I think it's a very smart and very it's obviously been very powerful, and I think that we all owe a great debt to the people who put it together, but we don't know yet. We're in a kind of empirical situation here where we just don't know what the outcome is going to be. We don't know what's going to happen on November 3rd, so we really don't have an answer to these questions yet. It's what we are all, everyone on this panel, and I assume everyone who's listening now, on some ways is trying to grapple with, and if we had, sort of the answer, we would all be rallying around it, but we just don't.
Can I offer one thing? Jump in.
Yeah.
I do think one thing that in the short term could be helpful is actually making sure that in the conversations about how to decarbonize climate policy in the U.S., particularly but in general, is more emphasis on the fossil fuel industry. We right now are seeing a lot of emphasis on public investment, demand side, et cetera, which makes a lot of sense. That will move a lot. But let's be honest, until we stop extracting, distributing, producing fossil fuels, we will not actually reduce emissions on the timeline that we have. And right now, that's when I say sort of instances where we sometimes use people of color buffer. In the conversations that I've had in DC, a lot of what I've heard is fossil fuels aren't politically winnable right now, right? Demand side is where we have alignment, right? And we're talking about resistance around fossil fuels from a number of about addressing fossil fuels, banning fracking, right? That was even taken out of, what was it, the DNC platform. I can't remember if it was banning fracking or banning money to fossil fuels, right? But that we have to recognize that resistance, as much as it is very real, right? It is costly politically. It is real that as long as we keep seeing things like the Joe Biden climate plan, which is wonderful in a lot of respects, as long as we're saying, the only thing we're saying is, look how far this has come since before, and not saying, but what about fossil fuels? We have to recognize that ignoring that, even if it is politically expedient, is ultimately a racial justice issue. And we have to be honest about that, and also recognize that because it is a racial justice issue, that is an obstacle to dealing with it. But again, if we don't deal with it, we don't move. So that's another instance of, it's easy right now to be quiet because I'm on it for a number of reasons, particularly that it affects largely people of color most intensely. But that still has a cost, because ultimately we're still not coming up with full solutions.
There's a question from the audience specifically about the fossil fuel industry. How can legislation that supports the subsidization of the fossil fuel industries be neutralized and more support directed by decisions to companies? So does it come down to voting and electing the right people?
Well, I think that's definitely a start. I mean, we've seen very dramatically how much influence the President of the United States has on our climate policies, on our environmental policies. There are over, almost 60 regulations that have been altered in the Trump administration, more happening every day. And clearly political leadership is critical. There's no question about it. There's a real difference. This is to Rhiana's point. If you look at the way fossil fuel companies, particularly oil companies that are European-based, are reacting to the climate crisis compared to those in the United States, there's a huge difference. And the difference is because the EU has a very different policy than the United States does. So, I can't emphasize enough how critical this election is up and down the ballot as far as getting serious about climate. We were on something of a trajectory. We would all agree it wasn't nearly enough under the last administration, but we have gone straight backwards, and we're still the country with the largest contribution to the climate crisis in the world. So we have a responsibility there. So, we have to stop fossil fuel subsidies, and the only way we're going to do that is through political leadership. And some places and other parts of the world are beginning to take steps in that direction, and we're not.
None of you have mentioned voting yet. One of my questions is, we are in this disruptive time. There's opportunities, we hope, coming up. What can we do, I guess? And I guess actually I would turn that question. You all, I'm sure, have superpowers. All women have superpowers. If you could use your most powerful superpower and you could change something, some aspect of the institutions, the policies, behaviors, what would you do after you get off this panel? What would be the first thing that you do that would have the impact that you're looking for?
I can get us started if that's all right.
Yes.
I would start to change, if I could, turn off our cameras here, close the computer, make a few calls, and change the world. I'll really start by trying to change how money moves around. And I think the policy regulations, I think they put us in a nice framing and provide incentives many times. But I think once people really start losing money, or the risk of losing money, or maybe opportunities to make money, right, to thrive economically, to Rhiana's point at the start, right, economic policies, climate policy, not only in the US, but in many other countries around the world. I think that's really where we can see a big change in the magnitude and the speed that we are all talking to the independent needs to happen, and a lot of people around the world. Right, I actually, I'm now in Canada, so I moved to Canada a few months ago, and I was looking for a few opportunities for jobs and what colleagues were doing, and I saw a posting for a sustainable investment officer at the Canadian Pension Fund. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. Maybe they're trying to invest in more sustainable businesses or lines of businesses, right? Maybe thinking about, let's say, sustainable agriculture or clean energy. And interestingly enough, they were hiring this unit to protect investments from the adverse effects of climate change. So it's a slightly different way of thinking about this, right? It wasn't necessarily investing in those things mitigating climate change, but protecting their own investments. And if you think the responsibility of a pension fund to protect their returns, right? They have a huge mandate. And if they were to change right now in investing into things that provide a lot of risk, it's pretty hard. But if we could change that and say, okay, I can build an incentive today for investors and financial markets around the world to be able to shift, let's say, 20% of their investments today to things that will provide a little more security for climate change and people in the world. Not sure if that's possible. That's a try.
Yeah, you can do it. What would the others of you do if you could tackle one thing after the panel today?
So this. Oh,
sorry, Rhiana, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say. So mine is sort of like corny, but I feel like one of my superpowers is empathy, which is odd. Mm-hmm. But if I could change one thing, I would sort of wave a magic wand and make everyone sort of suddenly have a belief that their life is worth no more and no less than anyone else's. Because a lot of what I run up, or the conversations that I have about climate policy, about transition, a lot of what it comes down to is fear, right? Fear of loss, recognizing that in any transition, no matter how much smoke any politician blows up anybody's ass, right, about this happening peacefully, just like with nothing changing, people inherently know that transitions bring change. And a lot of what I see is people trying to negotiate how much do I want to lose versus how much am I willing to let other people lose? Because, of course, our own pain always feels far more urgent than other people's. But a lot of the choices that we're making when we're talking about trade-offs, just the basis of those choices become different when you recognize that the same sort of pain that you feel, other people can feel that exact same thing, right? And do you want to do that? How do you want to interact with that? Do you want to cause that? And I think that a lot of this becomes a lot simpler when that is in place, because we are definitely running up against planetary boundaries, but a lot of our boundaries to action are about people, about the way people see themselves, about the way people see their society, et cetera. It has nothing to do with physics or the planet, right? Or any sort of natural law. So much of what the suffering that we're causing is purely just about people and the ways that we make choices.
Yeah, thank you. Mm-hmm. Francis, you were going to jump in.
It's hard. Would you pick a policy? Or what I would actually pick here in the United States, if I could wave a magic wand, is to enter a new era of common understanding and try to erase the divisiveness that permeates our society right now and makes it impossible to act on behalf of the well-being of everyone. I think that the last 6 months with the pandemic and is just emblematic of the situation that we're in this country. So if there's anything I could do, it would be to have us all wake up one morning and, feel that we're on the same page for the well-being of all of us, sort of to Rhiana's point, and stop the kind of trying to get the other guy attitude that we seem to be in all the time, and which prevents us from moving forward, because the climate crisis is here. It's real. It's going to devastate the lives of millions of people around the world, if not everyone at some point. And we just don't have time to make the changes that are necessary. I mean, the consequences are going to be so severe. We just got a, brief glance at it in the last month, but, that's going to become a regular situation. And, to me, that should be a motivator for everyone, that can't we get together on this and take the actions that are necessary? And I hope we do.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Elizabeth, would you like to express your superpower and what you would We have about 3 minutes left.
If I had a superpower, which unfortunately
You
I don't
do. I know you do.
Okay. I would, there's a big move, it can't really even be called a movement, but there's just sort of this idea out there that we need to put a lot more of the planet under some kind of protection for, once again, not for people, but for the, untold millions of species. We do not know how many other species there are out there with whom we share this earth. And I think that given the situation that we're in, which is, the sad fact of the matter is that we are not preventing a lot of damage. We are now in damage, we are in crisis management mode. We are simply, there's no going back. There's no putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. We can only try to minimize the damage, and we need to have, places, big parts of the earth where, other species can try to make it through what E.O. Wilson has called this sort of bottleneck, this moment that we're in of hopefully sort of maximum stress on planet Earth, and get as many species as possible through that bottleneck. So I think we need to, if I had a superpower, I would a wand, I would wave it on behalf of that.
Yes. One of the participants has asked, what are all of you doing to dismantle the systems of oppression within your organizations and the policies your organizations have put forward, considering that most of the staff in environmental orgs continue to be white and male dominated? And I think this question really speaks to Rhiana and Frances. Both of you have said, listen, we've got to get in this together and have empathy and recognize that there's fear on both sides of those who are oppressed by the system and those who need to give up their power, right? Have you, in your organizations, have you experienced or inspired or run a shift in just even in the staffing and the policies in the institution? Is that a place that you would suggest people start?
Well, I'll start, and then maybe Rhiana, you start.
Sure. Yeah, I wouldn't say, Frances ran NRDC, so she has much more experience here than I do. I do try. So I joke that I tried to make the Roosevelt program, or the climate program at Roosevelt, a tiny Wakanda. And that doesn't mean that we just employ people of color, but rather that everyone is actually treated the same. And what that has meant is, because there's different folks, particularly lots of men who are not used, right, to sort of being held to the same standards as women of color are. right? And so in our program, we really try to treat everyone equally and really sort of disabuse people of just because you're a man or X that you come in here and you're going to get sort of lots of passes. And so one of the things that we have tried in the program is to really start instituting a really sort of strict policy around sort of racism and discrimination, in the sense that you first get a call in, right? You have a conversation very frankly about what happened, right? About what went down, about how the behavior can change. And then, because I believe everyone should get called in and have the opportunity to hear about what they did and to adjust their behavior. And then if that behavior is not adjusted, then it's a problem. And then we're talking about formal consequences, but making that very clear from the outset. And also trying to make sure that everyone from management on down is aligned on that. And I haven't been at Roosevelt very long, but we have, had to use this policy a couple times. And, it definitely, I feel like has helped, at least in the context of our program.
Yeah, that's, thank you for sharing that. It sounds like starting at home is one place where we can start. And I'm very sorry, we are out of time. Francis, I know you had, but I need to wrap it up. Thank you very, very much, all of you, for your time and your efforts on the part of insects and humans and rocks and air, and for sharing your ideas with us. So my apologies for not letting everybody speak on this last one, but thank you very much for attending. Thank you, participants, for attending, and let's keep doing the good work.